Admiral Hill seemed calm and collected to those on the bridge. Actually, he was watching the development of the battle with more than a little worry, as he later told Nimitz. The airstrike, scheduled for 0545, failed to arrive until about 0620, which disrupted our plans a little, but we went right ahead with gunfire, holding up only for a few minutes after the planes arrived and took over. Fortunately, we had enough flexibility in our fire support plan to accommodate this change without too much difficulty. The bombardment really was terrific, and I don't see how any personnel, except those in bomb-proof shelters and dugouts, could have taken it. Everything above ground on that island was demolished: houses, trees, planes, etc. My aviator tells me there is one house left standing. During the preliminary period, we took battleships in as close to the reef as we could get them, which ran from 4,000 to 5,000 yards. Cruisers went in closer still, and we sent destroyers in onto the south shore to where they could use their automatic weapons. There were a few shots fired our way, but they were wild and very quickly silenced. For the H-45 to H-5 firing, as I think I told you, we lined up 3 battleships and 3 cruisers in the arc of a circle close to the reef at the west end of that island, and poured over 700 tons of metal into the landing beaches, an area of less than a mile long and 250 yards wide, just prior to the landing. It really was terrific, and will give you an idea of the strength of some of those concrete dugouts and blockhouses they had prepared. Hill sent Nimitz pictures taken 2 days later, which showed that Tarawa was covered with dugouts, pillboxes, blockhouses, and other fortifications so strong that 36 hours after being overrun, the Japanese were still holding out in some of them. Reports had it that some 4,000 workmen had been preparing Tarawa against invasion in the weeks prior to the operation. The island in the Tarawa atoll that they were actually attacking was Basio, some 291 acres. The defences included mined boat obstacles, barbed wire, and logs outside the beaches to divert landing boats into lanes covered by the Japanese shore guns. Behind the beach was a barricade which stood 3 to 5 feet high, made of coconut logs wired together. Behind this, commanding it, stood blockhouses and dugouts, connected by trenches, in which machine guns were set up with crossing fields of fire. Spotted at points of vantage were 14 coast defence guns, with underground storage vaults for ammunition and bomb-proof shelters for crew. Along the beach were some 25 37mm and 75 field guns, most of them in pillboxes, some armour-plated, and 13mm and 5.1-inch anti-aircraft guns, and 14 tanks that had been locked in position for use of their 37mm guns. For the Japanese defenders, here was a system of bomb-proof shelters so built that only armour-piercing or delayed action shells could break them down. As the big fighting ships blasted the island with shells, the 6 transports that carried the landing force began disgorging boats, which scurried about to find Amphtrax in the LSTs and put the Marines aboard, or circled, waiting. As the Japanese continued to return fire, the transports were ordered out of range, and they moved back, but their men were already out and in the smaller craft. The airstrikes began just before 0630 and lasted 7 minutes. Then came more gunfire from the ships, at random really, laid down on the beaches. Bisio resembled a Malay crease, and at the butt end of the crease was Green Beach. Moving along the north shore of the island from there were Red Beaches 1, 2, and 3. The naval guns swept all of them repeatedly. Minesweepers were also doing their work, making a safe channel into the lagoon. Above them flew Lieutenant Commander McPherson, dropping smoke pots to indicate shoal water. Hill's letter to Nimitz went on. Our plans had provided for sending 2 destroyers into the lagoon. We got them in safely, having marked turns in the channel by buoys marked by my flag aviator. We covered their entrance with smoke, and the plane also guided them through coral heads from overhead, as we could not go close enough to the beach to use the main channel. Those destroyers inside the lagoon, I believe, proved to be the decisive factor in getting the troops ashore. McPherson came back that day with a wounded rear seat gunner and holes in the fuselage of his plane, but he came back. The LSD Ashland also moved into the lagoon, and the Amphtrax began surging forward toward the beach from the rendezvous area. They were delayed by a choppy sea and current they had not expected, and H-hour was postponed to 0845 in the morning, then to 0900. The troops actually began moving ashore at 0913 on beaches Red 1, Red 2, and Red 3. "They'll go in standing up. There aren't 50 Japanese left alive on that island," someone on the flag bridge shouted. But the shout did not come from General Julian Smith or Colonel Merritt A. Edson, his chief of staff, who stood at the rail, watching silently through their field glasses. As the boats approached the beaches, the trouble began, and from the flag bridge of the Maryland it could be seen. In the water, a long way from the shore, the boats began to stop, apparently without reason. Then little green-clad figures climbed over the sides and started to wade in. "At that distance they seemed hardly to be moving at all," said McArdle. "They would be waist-deep now, and suddenly just their heads would be sticking out, and their arms with rifles clutched high overhead. Now and then one would slip down into the water and not appear again." The Japanese shore defences caused the Amphtrax to bunch up on the beaches, and the landing teams began to suffer heavy casualties. Wave followed wave. By the time the fourth wave began to move in, the tide was so low that the LCVPs, landing craft, vehicles, personnel, could not pass the reef, and the 37 guns had to wait for nightfall to get to the beach. The fifth wave, tanks from the LSD, were put off in 3 feet of water. Some were quickly disabled, others moved inshore, but the tanks on the red beaches were not to be decisive. Only 2 of them remained intact throughout the battle. Around noon, word came to flag plot from the beach that the Marines had established a beachhead. General Smith rushed over to Colonel Edson and thrust out his hand. "They've done it!" he shouted. Edson did not take the hand. "I'd rather wait, sir," he said. How right Edson was. The bloody beachhead was there, but the Marines were moving forward inch by inch under devastating fire. This was no make-in, not at all. On beaches Red 2 and Red 3, some 20 Amphtrax were stuck on the reef, under crossfire and shell fire from the island's big guns. There was a beachhead. Yes, some 1,500 Marines were pinned down on a narrow beach before the coconut log barricades. The tide was so low that the landing craft could not get in. On Beach Red 2, the Marines held a 200-yard front, tenuously. Their commander, Colonel Amy, had been killed in the water as he stepped off his Amphtrax. Colonel David Shoup, commander of the assault force, knew his landing was in deep trouble. Early in the afternoon, Colonel Shoup sent Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, the raider leader, back to the Maryland to make a report. So bad were conditions, off the beaches as well as on, that Carlson did not reach the flagship until late evening, and there McArdle encountered him. A boat pulled up alongside, McArdle recalls, and I looked down to see the weather-beaten face of a middle-aged Marine looking up at me. He had no insignia. He came clambering up the side on a rope ladder and asked me the way to the signal bridge. Having learned it myself the hard way, I was more than glad to give him a lift. On the way, he introduced himself. "You been to the beach?" I asked incredulously. "Just got back," he told me, grinning. He displayed a hole in his pants leg. "Lucky," he said. "Just got a nick." Carlson's report to Admiral Hill was anything but encouraging. Unless reinforcements and ammunition could be brought in to the beaches, they could not be held. The bombardment had simply not knocked out the Japanese, as those aboard the ships had expected. Later, General Holland Smith would complain that the bombardment was ineffectual, and still later Admiral Hill would remind Smith that his staff participated in the planning. At this moment, however, there was no room for recrimination. General Holland Smith at this moment was aboard the Pennsylvania, watching the sluggish movement of the 27th Division troops across Markin against light opposition. The first messages from General Julian Smith on the Maryland came an hour and a half after the landings on Tarawa. Successful landings on beaches Red 2 and 3, toehold on Red 1. Am committing 1 LT landing team from Division Reserve, still encountering strong resistance. Seeing Macon, it was impossible for Holland Smith to visualize Tarawa, but by afternoon he learned how dreadful the situation was on the other atoll. Julian Smith sent another message, reporting heavy casualties and asking permission to commit the 2nd Division's 6th Regiment, which was held in reserve. The battle was only a few hours old, and Holland Smith was immediately aware of the desperation on Tarawa. He knew Julian Smith, and he knew that this officer would not overstate his troubles. The last words of Julian Smith's message, "The situation is in doubt," sent Holland Smith to Kelly Turner's cabin, and together they agreed to commit the reserves on Tarawa. That night at Tarawa, Admiral Hill's ships retired 20 or 30 miles off the island. On the first day the ships had been able to deliver fire to help the troops, but as the Marines moved inland it became very dangerous, and less fire support was called for. The carrier planes came overhead, on request, and bombed and strafed, but the Japanese defences were extremely strong. McArdle, for example, went into the beach on the morning of D1, was stranded in his boat on the reef 300 yards offshore, and thus had an excellent view of a duel between a destroyer and a coastal gun in a pillbox, because his boat was caught in the middle. Eventually the pillbox must have caught one, for its fire stopped. By the end of the first day, 5,000 Marines had gone ashore, and 1,500 were killed or wounded. On D1 the reserves were committed. General Julian Smith went ashore. His boat was hit by a shell. He was dunked and had to wade in. He did not know it, but the Japanese were in serious difficulties, even by this time. Half the 4,500 troops in defence had been killed, and the other half were cut up into little units in pillboxes and blockhouses. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki's communications were cut off, and he was out of touch with his men, marooned in his own command post. During the night, some heroic Japanese had swum out to an abandoned freighter wreck off the beach. Others had occupied stranded tanks and amphtrax. They set up sniper posts and kept a devastating fire on the beaches and the approaches. That day, McArdle rounded up press copy from Richard W. Johnston of United Press, Robert Sherrod of Time, Henry Keyes of the London Daily Express, pictures by a press photographer and marine photographers, and artists' sketches by Bundy, and headed back for Pearl Harbor with the first reports of the battle. The reef and the tides were the worst enemies of the Navy and the Marines. The ships and planes kept up the fire support, and overhead the carrier fighters flew combat air patrol. But very little patrol was needed. So effective had been the strikes on Nauru and the other islands that the Japanese were unable to throw any serious air threat against the landings. The fighting was furious, and many men fell, killed or wounded. Even on the second day, Colonel Shoup was not at all certain of the outcome, at least not until late in the afternoon when he was able to report back, "We are winning." That welcome news came to General Holland Smith even as he was wriggling with the frustrations of watching an inept army force bogged down by its own weight on Macon. As noted, on the third day, the news came from Macon that the island was in American hands, and a few hours later word came from Tarawa that it had come into the hands of the Marines. But what a difference! The army on Macon lost 64 men killed and 150 wounded. The Marines on Tarawa had casualties of nearly 2,900, nearly a third of them killed or dead of wounds. And yet both islands were secured within a few hours of each other. When King and Nimitz had spoken of the Gilberts as a dress rehearsal for the marshals, they had been wiser than their subordinates could have dreamed. So many were the mistakes made in this action that Captain James Steele, back at Pearl Harbor, prepared a report called 100 Mistakes Made at Tarawa, and even before the island was secured, Admiral Hill was writing Nimitz about some of them. More LVTs, landing vehicle tracked, must be provided to carry in tanks, Hill said. He and Julian Smith had agreed that at least 300 should be made available for an operation the size of Tarawa. More LSDs should also be provided. The Marines should have amphibious tanks, so that in case they were stuck in deep water they could extricate themselves. More escort vessels should be provided. But these comments were mild compared to those of General Holland Smith when he came ashore and saw the signs of battle a few days later. No words of mine can reproduce the picture I saw when the plane landed after circling that racked and battered island. The sight of our dead floating in the waters of the lagoon and lying along the blood-soaked beaches is one I will never forget. Over the pitted, blasted island hung a miasma of coral dust and death, nauseating and horrifying. Chaplains, corpsmen and troops were carrying away the wounded and burying the dead. We had about 1,000 killed, and added to this nightmare of mangled bodies were the 4,000 to 5,000 Japanese. The Marines took 146 prisoners, but only 17 were Japanese. The others were Korean labourers. Holland Smith knew instinctively that he and the Marines would be severely criticised at home for the heavy casualties of this operation. Almost in a state of shock, he toured the island. "I don't see how they ever took Tarawa," he said. "It's the most completely defended island I have ever seen." In his tour of the island, General Holland Smith began to draw conclusions. He visited every pillbox and blockhouse on the western end of the island and discovered how ineffective had been the naval and aerial bombardments. Only one of the fortlets, said Smith, was destroyed by naval gunfire. All the rest had been taken by Marines with explosives and hand grenades. As the battle closed, the Navy suffered a severe loss. A Japanese submarine penetrated the American screens south of Makin and torpedoed the escort carrier Liscombe Bay, which blew up and then sank, taking 644 lives, including that of Rear Admiral Henry Mullenix, the commander. Earlier, the Independence had taken a torpedo. For the next few days there was a bit of mopping up in these islands and in others of the Gilbert group. Admiral Spruance remained in the area. Back at Pearl Harbor, the Nimitz staff meetings had been involved in very heavy argument on the eve of this action. Towers had opposed the entire Operation Galvanic until 3 days before Spruance's sailing. Then, for the next few days, Nimitz and his advisers had been completely wound up in the planning for the Marshall's invasion, which was next on the calendar. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were pushing Nimitz as early as November 7th for a date for Operation Flintlock, and on November 8th he had sent them a date of January 17th. Before the sailing of the fleet to the Gilberts, Pownall had suggested a carrier attack on the Marshalls as soon as the Gilberts were secured, one that would involve the carriers and the fast battleships. A few hours after the invasion of the Gilberts began, Towers asked in the morning meeting at Pearl Harbor that Spruance modify his orders and let the carriers move out to attack the Marshalls. Nimitz asked why Spruance had planned, as he did, to keep the carriers close by. Towers replied that Spruance was half expecting a strong Japanese naval force to move out from Truk and was ready to fight a fleet engagement. McMorris concurred, but Towers thought it would be better to put the carriers to use against the Marshalls' bases rather than leave them sitting ducks outside the Gilberts. Nimitz told McMorris and Sherman to draft such a dispatch to Spruance. On November 24th the strikes began, with one at Millie in the southern Marshalls, but it was not until November 26th that the carriers were released. Some of the carrier men claimed that the loss of the Liscombe Bay and the torpedoing of the Independence were the direct result of keeping the carriers as sitting ducks. But that was the job of escort carriers, as would be shown beyond doubt at Leyte. That day, Nimitz and several members of the staff took off in the XPB-2YI, which was the staff plane, and flew non-stop from Pearl Harbor to Funafuti. A message came in from Spruance protesting the aircraft disposition, and McMorris showed it to Nimitz. The Admiral simply said to ignore it and went on, bound for Tarawa to look over the results of the action. Spruance remained in the Gilberts. Most of the naval forces were sent away, the carriers under Pownall and Montgomery to hit Kwajalein and Votja and make aerial reconnaissance of the Marshalls for the future. Rear Admiral Lee, with 5 battleships, 2 carriers, and 12 destroyers, was sent back to the South Pacific, stopping at Nauru to bombard and smash the defences with carrier strikes. Early in December, the post-mortems on the Gilberts operation began. The public was involved to some extent, for Lieutenant Commander McArdle had taken dispatches for the press with him back to Pearl Harbor on D3, and Richard W. Johnston's United Press story was pooled among the 3 American wire services, not without bitter remarks by UP manager William Tyree in Honolulu. The story of the bloody, bitter battle was out. Some correspondents and many editorial writers said Tarawa was a terrible mistake, and so did some of Nimitz's commanders, particularly Holland Smith and Admiral Towers. In December, Nimitz supervised the picking up of the pieces, the discussions of the learning process at the Gilberts. Spruance came back to recommend in his report that air and surface bombardment should be measured in terms of days rather than hours. He also said that flat trajectory fire support ammunition proved ineffective against many shore targets, greater angle of fall required. That remark might have suggested to the airmen a need for the prolonged aerial bombardment of landing targets using armor-piercing and delayed action bombs. The airmen, however, were much more interested in fighting the battle of command and influence, it seemed, than in studying the uses to which their weapons might be put in such tactical situations. Or perhaps it could be said another way. The needs for naval bombardment, as shown at Tarawa, were still not really totally accepted. There were other recommendations arising from specific problems. Spruance wanted control boats to guide landing forces to favourable landing spots, a result of the pile-up of forces on the edges of the beaches. He wanted LVTs for assault waves and amphibious craft, or DUKWs for succeeding waves, a result of the wrecking of many of the AMPH tracks in the Tarawa operation. Other recommendations were for protection of the bomb stowage compartments of the escort carriers, a result of the explosion of Liscombe Bay's bombs when she was torpedoed, the development of night fighters for carriers, the result of a night attack on Radford's task group, which Radford was able to drive off because he had trained 3 pilots in night fighting, and flagships designed as headquarters ships for attack force commanders, the result of communications failures aboard the Maryland, because that old battleship's wiring could not stand the strain of the firing of those 16-inch guns. General Holland Smith had some suggestions of his own. For one thing, he wanted no more marine raider attacks on invasion objectives. Evans Carlson had raided Markin in August 1942 and made a name for himself and his battalion. But the fact was, Smith said, that the Japanese build-up of defences on Tarawa dated from that Markin raid, for the Japanese were astute enough to realise there was a purpose in the operation. There was no question about the mistakes, and everyone knew it, but it had been Nimitz and King who knew before the fact that the mistakes would be made, and that they would have to be made sooner or later. For even as Spruance and his armada were sailing for the Gilberts in the middle of November, Nimitz was holding special planning meetings with Vice Admiral John H. Newton, his new deputy, Rear Admiral McMorris, his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman, his new plans officer, and Vice Admiral Towers. The purpose? Closing in on Japan, with a foothold gained on the China coast. They talked about possible attacks on the Kurils and the seizure of Hokkaido as an airbase. Such operations would mean far greater armadas and far more extensive amphibious operations than Tarawa. Tarawa had been a bloody, costly victory, but in essence it had been absolutely necessary training for the Americans in the Pacific. Life was not all beer and skittles among the staff at Pearl Harbor. Holland Smith came back from the Gilberts operation to justify the name hung on him by his Marines, Howlin' Mad Smith, and he was very, very critical of the Navy's gun and air support of his boys when they went ashore on Tarawa. He gave an interview to the press, and although he said much of it was garbled by Navy censorship, the gist was plain enough. He was not pleased with events. This displeasure included Spruance's insistence that command of the expedition be in the hands of the naval amphibious officer until the beachhead was secured. Other frictions were exposed. The Army commander, General Richardson, complained that the shore-based airplanes had accomplished practically nothing during the Gilberts operation, and he blamed the naval command for this failure. Hoover blamed the Army training and Army directives that kept the bombers up too high. Towers blamed Spruance because, he said, Spruance had no experience in directing shore-based aircraft. The discussion became heated. On December 4th, after Richardson complained about the subordinate position of Army ground and air forces in the Gilberts operation, Nimitz held a special conference in his office. and at the end of it asked Admiral Towers to undertake an investigation. On December 5th, while Spruance was still clearing up details in the Gilberts, he proposed to Nimitz that he appoint a flag officer to be deputy to Admiral Hoover, taking direct charge of the American bases in the British Gilbert Islands. Towers was bitterly aware that Spruance proposed to use a non-aviator for this task, and he and Sherman pointed out that it would also foul up Army relationships to do so. So Spruance's plan was disapproved. The next day, terrible Turner was back in Pearl Harbor, and he presented to the staff a report on the Gilberts' operation. Holland, Smith and Turner agreed on one thing. The plans for the Marshalls now appeared far too ambitious after what they had learned at Tarawa. They could not take Kwajalein, Maloelap and Votja all at once, as planned. Holland Smith wanted to take Maloelap and Votja first. Nimitz and Sherman wanted Kwajalein. Other officers had other ideas. Nothing would be decided until Spruance returned. Admiral Spruance did return to Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1943, and the discussions began again. Towers went off to Canton Island on his mission. The others met each morning to talk. Towers was absent then, when Admiral Pownall brought Task Force 50 back to Pearl on December 9th. Pownall had been given permission to strike the Marshalls after the Gilberts operation, because Nimitz and Spruance wanted to know what was there, and wanted some of that Japanese power knocked out. 6 carriers went in on December 4th to hit the group, in one day of airstrikes. The Japanese air opposition was very strong, but many planes were destroyed on Kwajalein and Votja. Planes on the airfields at Roy were not destroyed. Admiral Pownall had grown restless in hanging about the edges of this Japanese strongpoint, and had decided to head home, even though those planes were still capable of inflicting much damage. One aspect of the strike had been to take pictures of the islands, and the pictures had shown the Roy bombers, and a bomber strip that was more than half finished on Kwajalein. Captain J.J. Clark of the Yorktown was furious with Admiral Pownall for refusing to stay in the area and hit the islands again, and when the task group arrived at Pearl Harbor, Clark went looking for his superiors. Towers, of course, was gone. Clark then saw Forrest Sherman and showed him the undestroyed planes on the ground. Sherman opened the door to the next room and called Sock McMorris in to see the pictures. "You want to see the fish that got away?" But he was equally interested in the airfield and took the picture into Colonel Ralph Robinson, Marine officer and assistant plans officer. "What do you think of that, Robbie?" he said. "Jesus, this is it," said Robinson. And the photo of the half-built airstrip was taken to Admiral Nimitz, who saw better than any other the importance of Kwajalein. As for his subordinate commanders, they had other worries, and thus other viewpoints. Admiral Spruance had been informed that as soon as the Marshalls were taken, the fleet must be released for use in the Southwest Pacific to support MacArthur's coming operations. The idea of losing his fleet worried Spruance greatly, particularly the thought of losing his fast carriers. The Japanese defense of the Marshalls was built about garrisons and fortified atolls protected by a series of airstrips, which extended in hopping distance all the way back to Japan. Thus, the Japanese could funnel aircraft into the Marshalls remaining in their hands and continue to strike the Americans after the fleet had left the new conquest. The way to stop this, said Spruance, was to take the outer islands first, such as Eniwetok, the westernmost atoll of the Marshalls. By taking the outer islands and cutting off the airfield chains, the Americans could destroy the Japanese hopping technique of defense. Eniwetok, for example, was 1,000 miles from the Marianas and the key position for air supply of the Marshalls. "I was strongly opposed to capturing Kwajalein and then to leaving it without fleet support when the fleet went to the South Pacific," Spruance said. "A considerable amount of shipping would be required for the build-up of Kwajalein, and it would be moving by a route within the Marshalls which we did not control." In the second week of December, with all the principals in attendance, Nimitz got down to cases. When should they go in the Marshalls, he asked. Then, as was sometimes his practice, he started around the room, asking each of the officers squatting on a folding chair just what he thought. "Raymond, what do you think now?" he asked. "Outer Islands," said Spruance. "Kelly?" "Outer Islands," said Turner. "Holland?" "Outer Islands," said Smith. And so it went with all the others except Nimitz and Forrest Sherman. Nimitz looked calmly about the room, his white brows steady, and his mouth set in that typical straight line. Then he spoke quietly. "Well, gentlemen," he said, "our next target will be Kwajalein." The final plan called for the first attack to be made on Majuro, an undefended atoll whose lagoon would give a good anchorage for the service squadron. Kwajalein was to be assaulted from two ends simultaneously, and if the troops could manage it, they would move on to take Eniwetok. Spruance, Turner, and Smith still had misgivings. Smith came around quickly like a good soldier. The others acceded to Nimitz's orders, like good flag officers, even against their judgment. But Nimitz had deduced that the fast carriers and land-based air from the Gilberts could knock out Japanese air power in the Eastern Marshalls before the landings. In a way, it was unfortunate that Admiral Towers was off on his mission when Captain Clark came in from battle steaming with indignation. By the time he returned, Clark and his navigator, George Anderson, had prepared a white paper complaining about Pownall's lack of aggressiveness and making the case for stronger use of the fast carriers. As often happens with such affairs, once the document was written, it began to assume a life of its own. Clark took his paper to Admiral Radford, Chief of Staff now to Admiral Towers, and to Towers himself. Not satisfied with their reaction, Clark decided to go even higher. He detached his No. 2 Combat Air Intelligence Officer, Herman Rosenblatt, and got him a ride back to Bremerton aboard the Lexington, which was going home for an overhaul, having taken that torpedo on the way back from the Marshalls. Clark told Felix Stump of the Lexington that Rosenblatt was going back on an air combat intelligence matter. In Seattle, Herman Rosenblatt got a ride to Washington in an airplane and took the paper to his brother Sol Rosenblatt, who was a lawyer and intimate of the Roosevelt family. Sol Rosenblatt said the paper should be seen by the president himself. Herman Rosenblatt then sought out Franklin D. Roosevelt, Jr. 2 days before Christmas he saw young Roosevelt and said he had a story for the president. "That was fine," said FDR, Jr. "Let's go up to Hyde Park for Christmas dinner." The young men went to Hyde Park. After dinner in the comfortable old dining room, FDR pushed back his chair and spoke. "Young man," he said to Herman Rosenblatt, "how is the war in the Pacific?" How they won War Pacific _final dot in DD 284, August 26th, 11/3/57, PM owned to the Marshalls 285. "Father," said FDR Jr., "this man has a story to tell you." So Herman Rosenblatt handed over his paper, and Roosevelt read it carefully. Then he told Rosenblatt to go back to Washington and to report to Artemus Gates on Monday morning. Rosenblatt went back to Washington and did report to Gates. He was told that he could go back to his ship. The matter was taken care of. Rosenblatt returned. By that time, changes had been made, and Captain Clark was sure that he had caused them with his action. "Insubordinate?" "Obviously," said Clark. "But I wanted to win the war. I felt it was a patriotic duty," he said years later in the oral history he prepared for the Columbia University Oral History Project and the Navy. "I think I did right," he said, "because I did not think we were being properly led, and I don't think I could have talked to anybody out there. It was the wrong place to talk. I think once in a lifetime something like that happens. It has to be done." The fact was, however, that Clark's insubordinate action had no meaning whatsoever. Indeed, had Nimitz or King known about it, there is good reason to believe that Clark's career would have come to an ignominious end right there, for neither commander would stomach such disloyalty. No, what had actually happened was that Towers, also upset by Pownall's failure to make what he considered to be the most aggressive use of the carrier weapon, had asked that Mark Mitcher be put in charge of the fast carrier force of the Pacific. Mitcher was, like Towers, an airman's airman. He was thin and wizened and brown, with the squint of a man who looks much at the sun. He had been in command of the Hornet when she ferried the B-25S to raid Japan. He had commanded her again during the Battle of Midway, and even though the Hornet had not distinguished herself in that battle, Mitscher had not been accused of lack of aggressiveness. Towers brought the matter up with Nimitz in a special meeting on December 23rd, as Hermann Rosenblatt was moving around Washington, trying to get access to the president. Towers began the discussion by asking for a more aggressive use of the carrier forces, and then went into some detail. Forrest Sherman backed him to the hilt. Nimitz was impressed, and he agreed to send a dispatch to Admiral King with that recommendation. On Christmas Day, as Hermann Rosenblatt journeyed to Hyde Park, Nimitz told Towers that Mitscher could be brought in as commander of the fast carrier force, but that it must not be done until after the Marshall's invasion. One reason for this delay was Spruance's reluctance to take Mitscher at all. The relations between Spruance and Mitscher went back a long way, to the days of the 1930s when Spruance had been Chief of Staff to Rear Admiral A.E. Watson, commander of destroyers of the Scouting Force, and Mitscher had been commander of Patrol Wing 2. One day at San Diego, when Mitscher was flying a scouting mission out of the base, the weather began to turn foul, and the big patrol planes bucked and shivered in the sky. Mitscher headed straight out for some time, but as the turbulence grew more severe, he began to fear for his scouting planes, and requested permission to return to base. The skies above San Diego were clear and blue. "Permission denied," said Admiral Watson. Mitscher flew on, the buffeting growing ever more severe, the rain pelting down so harshly that it distorted the view of the windshield of the plane, and the wipers could not keep up. A few minutes passed. Mitscher again radioed back. "Request permission to return to base." "Permission denied," came the answer. Mitscher squinted and grimaced, and his face grew hard. A few more moments convinced him that the weather was ever worsening and growing dangerous. "Am returning to base unless specifically ordered otherwise," he said into the radio transmitter. And then he pulled out the plug. Such incidents gave rise to the term aviator among non-flying senior officers who had no sympathy for the sometimes unorthodox views of their flying companions. And then there was Midway. That Christmas Day, 1943, Admiral Sherman suggested that Mitscher go out with Spruance on the Marshall's invasion, riding as a makey-learn admiral who would become a force commander. Nimitz liked the idea, but he refused to commit himself at that moment. But since the question of Pownall's aggressiveness had been raised by Towers, Nimitz now also wanted an appraisal of the other air officers who might be available for important commands. Towers came back with the requested appraisals. Vice Admiral Aubrey Fitch, commander of the Air Force in the South Pacific. All-around experience, physically tough, aggressive, popular, fine qualities of leadership. Rear Admiral John Hoover, commander of the Air Force in the Central Pacific. An enigma, physically fit, a positive character, not popular, standoffish, lack of close relationships between him and his staff, hostility to General Hale, tough job, not accomplished too well, ability as Commander Carrier Task Force untried. Rear Admiral Bernhard, prospective commander of an atoll. He was talkative, he was reported to do a good job at sea, but he had a bad leg. Rear Admiral Pownall, commander of Carrier Division 3. Overcautious in plans and operations. He worries intensely before and during operations. Lack of aggressiveness, resented by subordinates. Towers recommended Pownall be replaced by a more aggressive admiral, but said he would be pleased to have Pownall in any administrative capacity. Rear Admiral Mitscher. Tops for Carrier Force Command. Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman, Commander, Carrier Division 1. Self-interest. Very unpopular with aviators because of intolerance. Able but not for high command because personality absolutely precludes establishment of wholehearted loyalty. Rear Admiral R.F. Wood. Unpopular. Rear Admiral John W. Reeves, Commander of the Air Forces in the Aleutians. Efficient, determined. Rear Admiral A.E. Montgomery. Energetic, courageous, and determined. These recommendations were submitted, and Nimitz read them very seriously. 2 days later, Nimitz called a special conference. Admiral Newton was there, along with Spruance, McMorris, Sherman, Towers, and Pownall. Nimitz was very frank, as he could be without being in the slightest bit offensive. He told Pownall that he had been criticised by his subordinates and others as being too cautious, and mentioned the official reports of the carrier commanders. He was disappointed, he said, in the lack of effectiveness of the Kwajalein raid. Carriers were always at risk, said Nimitz, when brought against enemy positions, but they should be used to do the utmost damage. The purpose of the discussion, Nimitz said, was to impress on Pownall the need for aggressive action in the forthcoming operations, not to abuse him. Nimitz then said that he wanted an air operations plan from Pownall and Spruance immediately so he could study it. He would give Pownall entree to anyone on the staff that he might need. To soften these blows, Nimitz said gently that Pownall had performed very well as far as Spruance was concerned in the Gilbert's operation. Spruance had said as much. Pownall emerged from the meeting surprised and hurt. That afternoon he went to see Towers to discuss the problem. Towers, while he lent a sympathetic ear, was not really very sympathetic to Pownall's position. But the result of the furor raised by the airmen over these last weeks was not long in coming. Mitcher was to replace Pownall, and Pownall was to replace Towers, who would become Deputy Sinkpak and Sinkpoa, commander of the fleet and of the Pacific Ocean areas. It was far from what Towers wanted. He would much rather have had Mitcher's combat job any time. But the aviators had been complaining for many months that they did not have sufficient representation in high places, and now the complaint could be made no longer. December 25, 1943. March 1, 1944. Admiral McMorris was a very tough hombre, and that is precisely why Nimitz had brought him in to replace Spruance as Chief of Staff. He was called Sock for Socrates because of his prowess as a strategist, and a hangover from academy days. He was also called other names not quite so complimentary for other reasons. One day, for example, a brand new army colonel came to Fort Shafter and demanded a private jeep to take him between the fort and Honolulu. The people at the motor pool advised the colonel that they would be glad to give him a jeep, but first they needed a chit from the chief of the Joint Staff, which meant McMorris. So the colonel came to Makalapa, found his way to Admiral McMorris's office, and stated his case. McMorris, who had a face like a fried egg and was sometimes called the ugliest man in the Navy, screwed up his lips and said one word. "No." "Why not?" asked the colonel. What skin off McMorris's nose was it if the army wanted to give the colonel a jeep for his own use? It was not a Sinkpak jeep. It was not a Navy jeep. It was an army jeep out of an army motor pool. "No," said McMorris. "And why not?" repeated the colonel. "Because I'm a born soldier and I'm going to stay one," said McMorris. The situation at Pearl Harbor at the end of 1943 demanded similar treatment for the hundreds of self-serving requests that came to Nimitz's staff. And indeed that staff had become something of a nightmare to an admiral who liked, as Nimitz did, to have a handful of trusted men around him, all of them to be called by their first names, all willing to work day and night for the boss. At the beginning of the year, the entire staff numbered 49, from 4-star Admiral Nimitz down to ship's clerk Fred H. Haas, who was his personal stenographer, or writer, as the Navy has it. By the end of the year, the staff numbered 126, plus 67 communications watch officers, 5 operations plotting officers, and 15 officers assigned to the staff for various temporary duties. It took a very tough man to keep even the staff under control. That was McMorris. McArdle came to the conclusion that McMorris liked to eat public relations officers for breakfast. He was not alone. McMorris was shrewd, outspoken, and thoroughly loyal to Nimitz. He was also as contemptuous of many of the airmen around him as he was of public relations. And with the growth of the carrier force, the airmen were making themselves heard ever more loudly. At the end of 1943, as Nimitz prepared to meet again with Admiral King, one of the primary items on their agenda was the agitation of the aviators for more prominence in command. McMorris had some ideas about those demands. Promotion among naval aviators has been so rapid that nearly all who have had reasonably wide experience are flag officers, McMorris said. What the aviators were asking for, specifically, was that they be put in command of forces, or where they were not in command, that an aviator be designated as chief of staff or deputy, but aviation officers were not necessarily very good at surface ship tactics and strategy. McMorris continued, "Aviation admirals are at times so inexperienced in such matters that they do not even know of their weakness in that regard. Flag officers such as King, Halsey, Fitch, Pownall, to name a few, have had considerable experience in the employment of both ships and aircraft. Some of the younger aviation flag officers have devoted nearly all of their careers to matters exclusively and directly connected with aviation. The added proficiency gained in that regard has mitigated against their gaining the experience, knowledge, and some of the broader aspects of warfare." McMorris obviously was not going to win any popularity contests, even at Pearl Harbor. By the end of the Gilbert's operation, the matter of the press had begun to get out of hand, for several reasons. One was the reluctance of the Navy men to give out information about battles. They argued, quite rightly, that even to name a ship, under certain conditions even to name a type of ship, could be of great assistance to the enemy. Submarine operations, for example, were so secret that they simply were not discussed at all anywhere. But after Midway, the naval airmen found a ploy of their own. They sent such men as Lieutenant Joseph Bryan III and Commander Spig Weed out to the Pacific, where these officers rounded up information and then went back to Washington to write their articles and release them outside the Pacific commander's purview through the Bureau of Aeronautics. On the side of the Navy public relations men at Pearl were Forrest Sherman and Preston Mercer, the Admiral's flag secretary, and creating the most trouble for them were McMorris and Howell Lamar, Nimitz's flag lieutenant, sometimes known as Little Rollo, who controlled transportation and small boats, and felt it necessary to outdo the regulars in his devotion to standards of the Naval Academy he had never attended. The casualties at the Gilberts made the matter of public relations very important. Under-Secretary Forrestal had a very strong sense of public relations, and he did not at all approve of the way things were going. The correspondents who came back from Tarawa used the words bloody and slaughter in their dispatches, and for a time Commander Drake, McArdle, and Commander Murray Ward, the censor, carefully cut out the words. But eventually they gave up, because it was a bloody battle, and that impression had leaked out from a dozen sources in spite of censorship. They could conceal the number of casualties, but only until the press conferences of Evans Carlson and Holland Smith. Then the story was out, and the press at home was very angry because of the attempts that had been made to suppress it. The public relations men, representing the Navy, could argue that it helped the Japanese to learn how effective their defences were. The press would have none of it, because the press was certain the admirals were simply sitting on the information to avoid criticism. And so it went, with the Navy only gradually yielding. The case of the Japanese snooper became a celebrated issue of this type. One day, a Japanese submarine launched a scout plane, which followed an American plane back to Hawaii. The snooper was detected at the shoreline, but not before, and there it drew so much anti-aircraft fire that the pilot, if not planning to turn back there, changed his mind and hightailed it out of the area. In a matter of hours, the story was common knowledge in Honolulu, and the facts were released. The newspaper correspondents came to public relations to ask why the plane was not picked up out at sea by radar. The answer was that the American plane had screened the Japanese plane behind it. The correspondents asked for permission to write this explanation into their stories, noting that unless they did so, the American public would have a very poor opinion of the Pearl Harbor defenses. The answer was no. "It's been said before," said Barney McQuaid of the Chicago Daily News. "True, but just the same it can't be said now," said Commander Drake. Soon the irascible correspondent and the irascible public relations officer were standing toe-to-toe, tapping each other on the chest and shouting. The discussion was taken to Captain Mercer, who calmed both men and said that McQuaid could use the phrase detection devices similar to those used before Pearl Harbor, but could not mention radar. McQuaid snorted. He threatened to take his case to Frank Knox, who was his publisher as well as Secretary of the Navy. "Go ahead," said Drake. "I'm still talking for C.W. Nimitz." And of course he was. And of course the word got back to Knox that Navy public relations was the worst in the world, and the kettle continued to simmer in Washington. Part of the cause of the short tempers around Pearl Harbor at the end of 1943 was the lacing the Navy took on Tarawa, but part of it was physical. With the huge increase in staff, and more coming almost day by day, the headquarters building had to be enlarged, which meant building on more stories. First, a breastworks around the top of the building had to come off, which was done by air hammers during working hours. Public relations was on the top deck, and one of the machine gun nests that was being removed was directly above the public relations offices. It took 3 weeks to hammer off the stone. "All day long the hammering came down through the walls and shook our teeth," said McArdle, "filling the air with a din so palpable you could crack walnuts on it. At these times, even if you could hear the telephones ring, it didn't do any good to answer them. The conversation was strictly one way." It was a period of respite, but somehow there never seemed to be peace and quiet at Pearl Harbor. "Perhaps the bedlam at headquarters," said McArdle, "was chiefly responsible for the popularity of combat operations. There was not an officer in the public relations staff who would not have preferred being out forward where the shooting was than back at headquarters where the headaches were. And that applied to other officers too, such as Admiral Lockwood, who kept petitioning to go out on a submarine patrol, Admiral Towers, who wanted eagerly to have a task force, and Admiral Nimitz himself. As 1943 came to an end, the pressures grew much heavier on Nimitz. Although he possessed control over the most powerful naval force ever assembled, the assault shipping was already inadequate. There was a serious shortage of attack transports and all other kinds of assault and commercial shipping. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were calling for concurrent thrusts in the South Pacific, including the Southwest Pacific, of course, and in the Central Pacific. Nimitz was trying to make his plans so he could move the transports from Central to South Pacific and back again, using one ship to do 2 jobs. Preparing for the new year, Nimitz called Halsey to come up from the South Pacific for meetings to determine the course of action in that region. Halsey came up just before the end of the year and then went on to the West Coast. Nimitz and King were now thinking in terms of the next step, not the Marshals, which had been placed in the hands of Spruance as an operational matter, with planning completed. Spruance was to move into Kwajalein at the end of the month, and then mop up the Marshals as quickly as possible. He would have assistance from Admiral Hoover's land-based air and everything Nimitz could give him. What the planners were interested in at the end of 1943 was the way to go next. Halsey proposed to move into Green Island on February 15th. He wanted to bypass the stronghold of Kavieng and seize Manus Island, then build airstrips on the 2 islands for future moves ahead. At the King-Nimitz meetings early in January, this plan was explored thoroughly. Admiral King had some questions, and so did Nimitz. King pointed out that Green Island was no good for a naval base. Neither was Kavieng, said Nimitz. Halsey had argued for Green Island from the beginning, and he was the man on the scene. It was about time to put an end to the South Pacific operations. The plan had been to knock out the big Japanese base at Rabaul. Halsey had shown rather conclusively that the offensive strength of these 2 bases, Rabaul and Kavieng, had been knocked out by his air raids of recent weeks. But those places could still put up a wicked defence. With Tarawa fresh in mind, Halsey's superiors were quick to see his point. Green Island, 120 miles away, commanded the approaches to Rabaul. Emirau commanded the approaches to Kavieng. Manus, 220 miles from Kavieng, commanded the western approaches to both Rabaul and Kavieng. So it was decided at San Francisco that Kavieng and Rabaul would be bypassed. Halsey would take Green Island and MacArthur would take Manus. Halsey would also take Emirau. A tentative date of April 1st was set for both operations, and the word was sent to MacArthur to see if he would agree. Green Island would be taken by Halsey much earlier, on February 15th. Thus the schedule was set up: Flintlock, Kwajalein, the 31st of January, Spruance. Green Island, the 15th of February, Halsey. Emirau Island, the 1st of April. Halsey. US Island, the 1st of April, MacArthur. Eniwetok, the 1st of May, Spruance. The last of these, Eniwetok, would represent the wiping up of Japanese resistance in the Marshalls and the beginning of a new phase of the Pacific War, with the Japanese being driven back inside the holdings they had obtained at the end of World War I in the Central Pacific. The key to the Pacific, said King, was the Marianas, which ought to come next. The great Japanese base at Truk had been a thorn in the side of the Allies since the beginning of the war, and at various times plans had been presented to Nimitz to knock out the base. Knockout was fine at this point, and a major airstrike was to be made before April. It was then believed that the Japanese would move their fleet units out of Truk and make it possible to bypass that heavily defended position. A great deal indeed had been learned at the Gilberts. At this meeting, Forrest Sherman suggested that it might be possible to bypass Truk by taking Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. King was agreeable. Simply let it not be forgotten, he said, that all operations of the United States Navy were aimed at a drive through the Pacific to China, in order to make use of China's strategic position and her manpower in the final assault against Japan. To move along, suggested Halsey, they should seize Palau at about the same time as Saipan. They must also establish a base in the Bismarcks, said King, and once the South Pacific operations ended, the forces would be split up between MacArthur and Nimitz. Until this point in the Pacific War, any quarrels between MacArthur and Nimitz over the direction of the advance on Japan had been submerged in the demands of day-to-day operations, but the Navy had always held to a plan for operations against Japan, and successive generations of students at the Naval War College had followed it, working out the details time and again. Indeed, in September 1942, the tall, dark Hanson Baldwin, military editor of the New York Times, had visited Pearl Harbor and looked at the big war maps. "Why the hell are we started up from the Solomons when for 10 years we've planned a frontal movement west through the Mandates?" he growled to the young public relations man who was showing him around. The Americans had found themselves in the Solomons then because King insisted that the Japanese drive must be stopped before they could make use of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. But the essential plan mentioned by Baldwin remained the same. Not so MacArthur's plan for victory. His plan called for a return to the Philippines, with him in charge. He would move up through the Bismarcks, up New Guinea into the Sulu Sea, and there he would be joined by the forces of Admiral Nimitz, which would have taken the Marshalls and the Carolines. At that time, Nimitz would become MacArthur's admiral, securing Truk and wiping out the Japanese flank, while the general moved into the Philippines. The British, meanwhile, would move their fleet east through the Malacca Straits and seize Hong Kong. A combined Chinese-British-American force would reopen the Burma Road from India to China and move southward, smothering the Japanese. This plan had been regarded with favour by the combined chiefs of staff in its incipient stages, and MacArthur was moderately pleased. But the vicissitudes of war eroded the thinking of the combined chiefs by December 1943. The war in the Mediterranean was so vigorous that the British could not spare fleet units for a move to the west, and new developments in naval and aerial warfare had also changed matters. First, the Gilberts operation had shown the tremendous strength of the amphibious forces working with the fast carrier forces. Second, the Army Air Forces wanted a Pacific base for the new B-29 bombers with which General Arnold hoped to devastate Japan. So King's unchanged plan for the move across the Pacific had more appeal in January 1944 than it had shown a few months earlier. The war brought an amalgam of ironies. The Navy had never wanted to fight a war in the South Pacific, as Hanson Baldwin had so shrewdly indicated in his surprise when he saw it happening. The entire Southwest Pacific approach to the war was foreign to Navy thinking. It was the result of General MacArthur's vanity and the shortage of military leaders in 1941 who knew the Orient, plus the desperate need to stop the Japanese at Guadalcanal, that had produced this first irony. The whole Central Pacific campaign, as it developed, was keyed to the rapid development of hardware, the fast carriers, and then along in the middle came the Air Force's B-29S, which changed the strategy and made the Marianas into a key target. The basic differences in strategy between the Army and the Navy brought frequent mutual irritations. In December, General MacArthur sent representatives to the Cairo Conference, where the combined Chiefs of Staff were in session, and King was fully aware of the attempts by MacArthur's men to bring about a change in the plans. Some of the Southwest Pacific Air Generals were taking exception to calls for their aircraft to bomb ships and shipping. Since Nimitz had been pushed into forming a joint Army and Navy staff, a huge and growing combined staff operation, which he cordially disliked in principle, it was an annoyance to him that neither MacArthur nor Eisenhower had joint staffs. Certain other Army practices were annoying to the Navy men. For one thing, the Army Air Forces had only 35 air crews per heavy bombardment group, which was not enough to do the job properly. General Marshall, on a recent visit, had agreed, but the Army had refused to raise the number of crews for the 7th Air Force, which was detailed to the Central Pacific, and General Richardson was unwilling to reopen the question. Halsey was particularly upset because the Army was awarding medals in such large numbers that the effect was terrible on the Navy flyers, who got medals only for distinguishing themselves. And Halsey suggested that he would like to move his headquarters from Noumea up to Manus Island when that area was taken. The two matters, aviators and inter-service relations, were to be serious problems in the months to come. For some time it had rankled Captain J.J. Clark that a TBF, torpedo bomber flight crew, had been lost during the Marcus raid. Now someone at Pearl Harbor was saying that Pownall had deliberately left the crew to perish. Pownall asked the commander of Torpedo Squadron 5, Commander R. Upson, to make a statement, and Upson stated in writing that on August 31st cruiser planes had searched for the TBF crew reported down, and then Torpedo 5 had sent 8 TBFs out to search 175 miles under conditions of excellent visibility. They had not found the life raft. The personnel participating in this search, who were shipmates of the missing crew, were all satisfied that a thorough search had been made. The letter was forwarded through Captain Clark, who had been quite voluble in his previous and later complaints about Pownall's refusal to take the task force in search of the life raft. Clark also wrote a letter stating that he was satisfied that a thorough and efficient search had been made by Torpedo Squadron 5. But Pownall's fate was sealed, and had been for some time in the sense that he lost the fighting command. Although changes had been ordered, Nimitz had been talking to King about moving Pownall to the West Coast as air commander to take the place of Mitcher, for Mitcher had definitely been selected as new head of the fast carrier forces of the Central Pacific. Spruance was not at all pleased with the changes, and he insisted that Pownall come along on the Marshal's operation, riding on Spruance's flagship and acting as Spruance's unofficial air advisor. Pownall was thus kept in action for a time, but no longer as commander of the first carriers. Spruance's valiant defence of Pownall helped, for Nimitz respected Spruance's judgment, certainly more than he did that of Towers. It was arranged then that Newton would become available for other command, Towers would be the new deputy, and Pownall would become air commander in the Pacific. Since the job was basically administrative, no one could complain, except Pownall, and like most Academy graduates he had been so long disciplined and self-disciplined that he accepted his lot with the best grace he could muster. Operation Flintlock was even bigger than Galvanic. Nimitz was in charge. Spruance was in command of the overall force, which was now called the Fifth Fleet. Turner was in charge of the Joint Expeditionary Force, with Holland Smith on his flagship, the Rocky Mount, as overall commander of ground forces. Smith claimed that Kelly Turner always had suppressed ambitions to be a general and had tried to euchre him out of the command. Smith said that a week before sailing date he had seen a directive that omitted his name, and that only by going to Spruance had he managed to secure places for himself and his staff in the actual operation. Perhaps. Spruance's chief of staff, Captain Moore, spent a good deal of his time refereeing arguments between the strong-minded Turner and the equally opinionated Smith. Sometimes, Moore said, Smith was a crybaby, so great was his affection for his Marines, and so deep his suspicion of the Navy in relation to the Marine Corps. Turner himself commanded the Southern Attack Force. Rear Admiral R.L. Connolly led the Northern Attack Force. Rear Admiral Harry Hill led the Majuro attack force. And so powerful was the American fleet participating here that it was possible to keep a task group in reserve under Captain D.W. Loomis. On the ground on Kwajalein, the troops of the Southern Force would be led by Major General H.C. Corlett, and the troops were the 7th Infantry Division of the Aleutians. The Northern Attack Force would be the 4th Marine Division, with Major General Harry Schmidt in command. Harry Hill's smaller Majuro landing would be accomplished by the 2nd Battalion of the 106th Infantry Division. Again, the operation came from diffuse sources. The Northern Attack Force sailed from San Diego, where the 4th Marines had trained, stopping at Pearl Harbor and picking up the Southern Attack Force. Harry Hill's Majuro force sailed the next day.